morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue reading A Prophet in Babylon. We're reading chapter 22, part B today, and if you'll remember last week we ended with a discussion happening between Butler, Gaunt, and Palmer regarding the funeral of Gordon, who had just passed away. Butler sat silent during this discussion. His face was anxious. "Have you no counsel to give?" said Gaunt with a smile. "I had rather state facts," he replied quietly. "It will be time enough for counsel when we get our facts clear." "Well, what have you to say?" said Gaunt. "First, that we are bound to respect Gordon's wishes. The service must be held in the mission hall, and the actual converts of the mission are the first people to be invited. Gordon loved them. Many of them loved him. It is quite extraordinary that he should have had so great an influence over them, for his visits to the mission were not frequent. I confess that I feel a kind of noble pathos in the fact. 25 years ago he tried to reach these very people and failed. In his last days he found the way to their hearts. We may mourn him deeply, but none will mourn him more deeply than those poor people. He was the prophet of the poor. The poor have a right to their prophet." "Yes, that is certain," said Gaunt. "But something else is certain too," said Butler. "You can't get these poor people together in the daytime. They can only come at night. Therefore the service must be held in the evening. That is where the element of danger begins. You know what that street is like at night. I have reason to think that the saloons will take this opportunity to revenge themselves upon us. It is a unique opportunity. They will have us all bunched together, and God knows what violence they may attempt." "Do you really anticipate violence?" said Palmer. "I do," said Butler. "You will remember what I told you about my friend, the ex-pugilist. He knows all the movements of the district. He tells me he is certain that our enemies meditate violence." "Well, we must take our risks," said Gaunt with a smile. "They are your own words." "What if the risk is death?" said Butler in a low voice. "Then we can but die," replied Gaunt. "Very good," said Butler. "I expected you to say that, but I thought it my duty to warn you." "Thank you," said Gaunt. He grasped Butler's hand in a long embrace. Then the moment of tense emotion passed, and the three friends, with complete composure, returned to the task of planning Gordon's funeral. When Butler had conjectured that many thousands of adherents of the League would wish to be present at Gordon's funeral, he had not overestimated the public interest. On the day after Gordon's death, the press was full of articles on his career, memoranda of his conversations, estimates of his character and influence, and these were almost wholly eulogistic. To Gordon came the rare good fortune of having outlived the enmities which his early career had excited. Of his former antagonists but few were left, and they were no longer antagonists. These also now joined in the general acclaim. Each mail brought Gaunt letters of appreciation for the character of Gordon, and in every instance the writers of the letters expressed the desire to take some humble part in the funeral of the dead prophet. As Gaunt read this vast mass of correspondence, it became clear that in spite of Gordon's deprecation of any public ceremony, nevertheless, his obsequies were bound to be attended with a great popular demonstration of respect and affection. Once convinced of this, Gaunt did his utmost to make the demonstration effective. He fixed Saturday night for the simple service in the mission hall, and invited all the people in the habit of attending the mission, especially known converts, to be present. Members of the League were requested to line the street and to wait reverently for the conclusion of the service. At the close of the service, the body of Gordon was to be conveyed to Madison Square Garden, accompanied by members of the League in procession. In the vast auditorium, which had seen the birth of the League, the body would rest through Saturday night. Early on Sunday morning it would be laid to rest. "It is not often New York honors a prophet," said Gaunt. "Gordon would at any time have given his body to be burned for love of the people. I think he would be willing, if he could know, to give his body to this brief honor, if a single heart might thereby be touched with a single good desire." And now the Saturday night had come. The great city clothed itself with light, and through the brilliant streets rolled a glittering river of frivolity. But here and there in the vivacious crowd other figures were discerned. whose goal was not the restaurant or theater. They were people of earnest brows and sober dress. They were all moving eastward, and upon each breast was a cross of stars. They gathered from far and near. Many had traveled from distant cities. They represented all grades of society. But the same glad and earnest look distinguished each. The common goal of all these pilgrims of the night was a plain mission hall, in which lay one who even in death drew them by the magnetism of reverence and love. Beyond 14th Street their numbers became apparent. They composed a multitude of many thousands. Yet there was not the least disorder. Each took his place in the long double line which garrisoned the street. Each stood in perfect silence. Presently the whisper passed along the ranks that the service for Gordon had commenced, and each man stood with uncovered head, and the women bowed their faces in sympathetic prayer. In the mission hall itself the scene was one not to be forgotten. The hall was completely filled with the poor. Such a crowd of tragic faces, some seamed with devastating passions, some simply worn with years of fruitless struggle. Such eyes, some sadly joyous, tear-filled, yet bright with new-kindled love. Others pathetic, with the pleading of defeat against the weakness of the will. Such tokens of ill usage of life, in bowed shoulders, narrow chests, coarsened hands. Here were, indeed, the people of the abyss. The people of that populous, dim underworld, whose very existence is unsuspected by the well-fed and the happy. And yet in the general aspect of that strange throng there was more of hope than sadness. Deep sunk as they were, the day-spring from on high had visited them, and on their patient brows the glow of hope's morning burned. And for this strange congregation all that was meant by light and hope was represented in the quiet dust that slumbered in a flower-covered coffin, which shattered on the air like fragrance of life, an emblem of beauty rather than of decay. Few of these people had known Gordon personally. Some had heard his voice on rare occasions when he had spoken in the hall. Some had grasped his hand, and here and there were those who owed their souls to his entreaties and his prayers. But there was not one who did not understand the meaning of Gordon's life. They knew that he had loved them, and that he had suffered for them, and that his life had spent itself for their enrichment. To these who had never touched his hands, he was less a man than a symbol. He was the symbol of love, of pity, of more than human faith in them, of kindness in a world of hatred, of helpfulness and justice in a world which they had found hostile and unjust. And so from his silence there breathed the encouragement of brotherhood, and the fragrance of the flowers that covered him was a perfume blown from unknown accessible Edens which he had bade them enter. The sisters began to sing. Gray-robed, quiet-eyed, they stood behind the banked flowers, and it was through the flowers they sang. So soft, so tender was the music. Beyond the parting and the meeting I shall be soon. Beyond the farewell and the greeting, beyond the pulses fever beating, I shall be soon. Beyond the gathering and the strewing, I shall be soon. Beyond the ebbing and the flowing, beyond the coming and the going, I shall be soon. And then the voice of Gaunt, low, musical, intense, began to speak. Of Gordon himself he said scarcely a word. Rather he spoke as Gordon might have spoken to them. Beyond the gathering and the strewing, it was that they had to think of. With delicately tender touches he drew back the curtain of that unseen world. It was their world, the world where all who lived rightly would meet, when the weary comings and goings of this life were over. They listened entranced. They seemed to see themselves no longer disinherited, but walking among happy throngs in tranquil light, and looking back with a kind of rapturous commiseration on the distant world which they had left. Oh, to be there, beyond the parting and the meeting, beyond the farewell and the greeting. The voice of Gaunt broke into a sob and ceased. Then, as though recalling him and all of them to be present, the choir began to sing the hymn of the League, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. The doors of the hall were flung back. The hymn was taken up by the waiting lines of Leaguers in the street. Like a solemn chant it rolled from lip to lip along that mile or more of mourners. From the doors of the hall the sisters came forth, singing. Behind them all that was mortal of Gordon followed, and behind the flower-covered bier walked Gaunt, Palmer, and Butler. As they passed into the street, a man pushed through the crowd and whispered a word in Butler's ear. The man was the ex-pugilist. Butler's face paled. He moved closer to Gaunt, shook his head, and the procession swept on. It was just 10 o'clock. Butler noticed that about 100 yards from the mission hall, where the street narrowed, the crowd seemed impenetrable. At this point the lines of Leaguers were broken, the crowd swayed dangerously, and there were shouts and jeering voices. Every window was wide open, and people leaned out, mostly silent, some shouting a few boisterous jests to the crowd beneath. The crowd was densest at this point, where a saloon stood, which the League had closed. Butler instantly recognized the danger point. It was to warn him that mischief would be attempted at this point that the ex-pugilist had taught him. His first thought was for Gaunt. He seized the arm of Palmer. "Close up around him, men," he said in a hoarse whisper. Gaunt, quite unconscious of their intention, was at that moment about a yard ahead of his friends. His head was bare. He was singing with complete absorption the great hymn which had witnessed the birth of the League. Butler and Palmer sprang forward to his side, but it was too late. At that moment, from an upper window, a pistol shot rang. Gaunt fell with a bullet in his breast. 50 yards away, his followers, quite unconscious of what had happened, were still singing, "When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride." And that's the end of chapter 22. Next week we'll continue with chapter 23, part A, The Valley of the Shadow. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.